Hi guys, tonight's story, the harshest winter of the late Middle Ages, how people survived. The chill begins, November's surprise freeze, so imagine you're living in Europe in the fall of 1431. You've just wrapped up the harvest. The fields have been picked clean of whatever stubborn vegetables managed to grow that year, probably turnips. Maybe some barley, a few onions if you were lucky. There's a faint scent of smoke in the air, the kind that curls from cottage chimneys and carries the smell of damp straw and something boiling that may or may not qualify as soup. It's chilly, but nothing out of the ordinary. Not yet. The sky's been gray for a few days. That heavy, low kind of gray that makes the daylight feel like dusk, and your bones feel like they're being slowly turned into wood. And then sometime in late November, it happens. The cold comes. Not a friendly kind of cold like the kind that dips at your nose and makes you think of mittens. No, this is the kind of cold that sinks into the soil, freezes your boots to the floor, and turns your breath into little frozen ghosts that hover around your face. It didn't come all at once, either. That would have been almost polite. Instead, it crept in, quietly, like frost crawling across a window pane, 1 invisible inch at a time. By November 20th, the rivers started freezing. The Rhine, the Danube, the Seine, even the little creeks that ran through sleepy villages, they all turned to ice. Not just a thin layer you could crack with a stick. No, these were thick, solid sheets of ice, the kind horses could walk on, the kind that made the boatmen curse and the merchants weep, the kind that stayed. And just like that, everything stopped moving. Boats were stuck. Carts got abandoned. Roads became sheets of crunchy white silence. Villagers stood at the riverbank in wool hoods and half-frozen boots, watching the water they used to drink and fish from turn into something they couldn't even break. If you were lucky, you had a little warning. A few extra days to haul in the last of the firewood, check your roof for leaks, and double-wrap the chickens in straw. But most people, they were caught completely off guard. After all, winters in Europe were usually cold, but not like this. Let's visit a little village tucked somewhere between what we now call Germany and France. Just a cluster of thatched roofs, crooked chimneys, and one extremely grumpy cow. The people here aren't rich. Most of them have 1 room to live in, maybe 2 if they're lucky. The walls are made of wattle and daub, basically a medieval version of mud and sticks. Cozy in theory, drafty in reality. There's no insulation, no glass windows, just shutters and fabric nailed to frames. The wind sneaks in anyway. It always does. At first, the villagers think, well, this is unpleasant, as they shuffle around their houses in layers of scratchy wool, trying to keep the fire going and arguing about who forgot to bring in more kindling. By the second week, they stop being surprised when their water buckets freeze indoors overnight. By the 3rd week, they're waking up to find frost on their bed sheets, despite sleeping in full clothing and wrapping themselves in anything vaguely warm, including, in some cases, the family dog or goat. Everyone's breath hangs in the air like little clouds. The windows are covered in intricate frost patterns that look beautiful if you squint, until you remember it means the wind's winning. Outside, everything goes quiet. The birds are gone. The trees don't move. Even the animals stay close to. Their barns huddled together in steaming piles of fur and misery. You can hear things cracking in the forest, trees splitting from the cold, ice creaking as it grows. In some places, people start to worry. Is this a punishment from God? Did someone forget to tithe properly? Did the monks forget to pray for good weather? Superstitions run wild because science hasn't quite caught up yet. The average medieval villager doesn't know about climate patterns or sun cycles or volcanic ash in the upper atmosphere. All they know is that the world feels colder than it ever has, and there's no sign of it stopping. Let's check in on a little family, a man, his wife, 2 kids, and an aunt who never stops knitting. They're doing their best. They eat whatever's left from the harvest. Dried beans, a few turnips, maybe a salted herring or 2. The bread's getting stale, the butter's gone. The cheese is sweating or freezing, depending on where you set it. The fire is the heart of the home, and it has to be tended constantly. If it goes out in the night, they'll wake up to frostbite. Or worse, but firewood is running low. And chopping wood in this kind of cold, it's dangerous. Tools snap, fingers go numb. You have to make choices. Cook a meal or stay warm. Boil. Water or keep the light going. Outside the village, in the forests, things get spookier. Tracks start appearing in the snow. Not just deer or rabbits, but wolves. Big ones, starving ones. Animals that normally wouldn't go near people are now slinking close to barns and fences, sniffing for anything edible. The villagers double bar their doors at night and listen to the howls echo across the frozen hills. By the end of December, it's clear that this isn't just a harsh winter. It's something worse. And it's only just begun. People whisper that the river hasn't thawed in weeks, that even the Venezia Lagoon down south has frozen over, which almost never happens. That's the kind of cold that makes rich people nervous. Word travels slowly, but it travels. The next village over says the frost came early there too. The monastery to the east says their grain stores are already half gone. The traveling merchant hasn't come back, probably because the roads are ice rinks with wolves. Still, life goes on, sort of. People layer up. They crowd together at night. They say their prayers. They mutter about spring like it's a fairy tale. And they wait, because what else can you do when the earth itself has frozen? All you can do is hope it remembers how to thaw. Eventually. Frozen rivers, silent roads. So, now that winter has fully arrived, and not the cute storybook kind, it's time to talk about how things started. Stopping. One of the most dramatic signs that this wasn't your average chilly season was the rivers, big ones. The kind that normally kept life moving across medieval Europe. The Danube, the Rhine, the Seine, and even smaller local streams, they all froze. Solid. For months. Now, that might sound kind of peaceful, like a snow globe, or a postcard, but for people in 1431, it was a disaster in slow motion. You see, rivers weren't just pretty scenery. They were roads. They were how food got to towns, how merchants moved their goods, how people traveled between villages without disappearing into the forest and getting eaten by something with claws and opinions. So when rivers froze, life slowed to a crawl and then to a stop. Let's say you're a tanner in a riverside town. You're waiting on a delivery of leather from up north. You've got customers, orders, maybe even a little coin saved for Christmas. Except now, the boat's frozen 2 towns back. The crew was holed up in a barn, trying to keep their toes attached, and your precious leather? It's frozen into a block of ice inside a barge that's now part of the landscape. Tough luck, Dot, in some places. People tried to keep moving. They chopped at the ice with axes. They tried to break it apart, but it just kept reforming thicker each night. Some folks even thought about pulling carts across the ice. And to be fair, sometimes that worked, until it didn't. More than one poor soul ended up in an icy grave after trusting a river that only looked solid. And pulling a cart full of firewood across a frozen river in medieval shoes? That's not a job. That's a punishment. And it wasn't just the rivers. The roads, if we can call them that, weren't faring much better. Most medieval roads were just dirt paths that had been stomped down by generations of muddy boots, hooves, and wooden wheels. In the cold, those turned to stone, then to ice, then to long white trails of silence. Carts couldn't pass. Horses slipped. People fell and cursed and limped home with bruises and pride injuries. And if you thought salt might help, well, good luck. Salt was expensive, and people needed it for preserving food, not sprinkling on icy paths. If you had extra salt, you weren't spreading it around. You were hoarding it like treasure in a chest. So what happened? People stayed home. That meant markets got smaller. Trade slowed. News stopped coming in. Rumors started to grow like frost on the window, they say. It's just as bad in the South, someone might whisper. Worse, another might reply, eyes wide. They say Venice froze, and then everyone would go quiet. Because if Venice froze, then this wasn't just a bad winter. This was something else. Some tried to walk between towns anyway, wrapped in layers, faces covered with whatever cloth could be spared. But even the simplest journey turned into an expedition. Boots froze, toes went numb, snow covered landmarks. Paths vanished, and the woods, still full of wolves, still watching. If you made it to the next village, you might get a weak bowl of broth and a straw mattress for the night, if they had any to spare. But odds are they were just as cold and hungry as you. Even the mail stopped, though to be fair, mail in 1431 wasn't exactly fast in the first place. Still, if you were waiting on a letter from your cousin or a tax document from the Lord's Manor, you were going to be waiting a long time. Couriers weren't risking their horses or their lives just to carry a parchment through a frozen forest. Not for the kind of pay they were getting. And so Europe fell quiet. The usual sounds of carts creaking, hooves clopping, merchants shouting, children running gone. Instead, it was muffled footsteps, the hiss of wind through shutters, the far-off creak of frozen branches. Sometimes nothing at all. If you walked outside early in the morning, when the frost was still sharp and the sky was that pale grayish white, you could hear your own heartbeat. That's how still it was. And for some, that was the scariest part, because when the world goes quiet like that, you start wondering if it plans to stay that way. Villages that usually traded with each other just stopped talking, some isolated themselves entirely, afraid of disease or hungry travelers. Others tried to keep up rituals of normalcy. Markets shrank but stayed open. Church bells rang shorter services. Children were still set to gather firewood, though now they were followed by watchful eyes and reminded not to wander. Sometimes the silence was broken. A traveling monk, A desperate merchant, a soldier on some frozen mission. Their arrival would be like a story entering town. People would gather around fires to hear what was happening elsewhere. Is it warmer in the south? Did the king say anything? Has the sea frozen too? The answers were vague. The stories changed with each telling. But people held on to them like matches in the dark. And then, one day, someone spotted wolf tracks on the main road, not in the woods, not in the hills, but right in the open right where carts and traders used to pass. The wolves, it seemed, were no longer waiting on the edges, but that's a story for another chapter. For now, just know this: the rivers were frozen, the roads were silent, and across Europe people began to understand this wasn't a winter they could wait out. It was a winter they would have to survive, together, or not at all. The farm that froze. So, let's talk about farms, not the sunny springtime kind with chirping birds and freshly turned soil. Not even the muddy autumn harvest kind with the last potatoes getting yanked out of the ground and goats bleating about. Nothing in particular, no. We're talking about the 1431 kind of farm, the kind that froze. And not just froze like, oh, I need another blanket. We mean froze like, we may not make it to April. Picture a farm in the countryside, somewhere in what's now Germany or France. A small plot of land, a crooked house with smoke trickling from the chimney, a barn that leans to the left when the wind blows, chickens, a cow or two, and maybe a goat that hates everything. That's the scene. Now bury it in snow, cover the fields in a thick, white sheet that won't melt for months. The ground is solid as stone. The tools left outside are fused to the earth. The barn doors are frozen shut, and the chickens look like they're rethinking their entire career. The real problem, though, wasn't the snow. It was what came before the snow, you see. This cold snap didn't politely wait until December, it barged in early, right around harvest time. Just as people were trying to bring in the last of the grain. Just as root vegetables were almost ready. Just as apples were starting to blush. And then bam, frost, ice, unseasonable wind. Fields gone stiff. A lot of the crop never made it indoors. Grain especially took a hit. Medieval farms depended on it for bread, gruel, porridge, and beer, which, let's be honest, was probably the most emotionally important. But when the fields froze too soon, the grain didn't dry properly. It got moldy, or stayed damp, or just died in the field. That meant less flour, and less flour meant thinner bread, shorter meals, and a lot of very cranky peasants. What about animals? Well, they didn't love it either. The pasture grass froze early, so farmers had to start feeding hay weeks ahead of schedule. But winter stores weren't infinite. By January, the haylofts were already looking worryingly empty. And cows eat a lot. Some farmers tried to stretch the supply by mixing hay with chopped straw or dried leaves. Others just rationed harder, hoping spring would come early. Spoiler alert, it didn't. And then there were the barns. You'd think a barn would be a cozy place in winter. Warm animals, hay everywhere, soft mooing sounds. But no, barns were cold, and often barely sealed. Gaps between boards, thatched roofs that let in wind, doors that froze shut. Sometimes animals froze right alongside the farmers. Chickens laid fewer eggs or stopped altogether. Cows gave less milk. Goats kicked more. often than usual. They always do. But this winter they really committed. Let's peek inside a little farmhouse kitchen. It's dim. The fire crackles low. A pot of something stew-adjacent simmers on the hearth. It smells like onions, turnips, and hope. Maybe a bone, if they had one. Or maybe they're just boiling the same root they boiled yesterday and the day before. The family eats slowly, quietly. Every bite counts. Bread is sliced thinner. The butter's long gone. Salted meat is for Sundays maybe. Everything else is roots, dried beans, or things pickled last year. The kids ask when spring is coming. The adults say soon. And don't look each other in the eye. And here's a fun little disaster. The water barrels froze. Indoors. Usually families kept barrels or buckets of water near the hearth. But that year, even that wasn't safe. People woke up to find solid ice in their homes. You had to chip out drinking water with a knife. It was like living inside a freezer you didn't order. Even beer froze. Medieval beer, warm, cloudy kind of chewy still turned to slush in the cold. That's when you knew things were serious. Outside the tools were no better. Axes cracked. Plow handles split. Rope stiffened like iron. Trying to repair anything was a nightmare, because even your fingers didn't want to cooperate. Imagine trying to fix a fence when your hands feel like fish wrapped in burlap. You drop every nail. You swear a lot, eventually. You just go back inside and pile more straw around the barn door. Oh, and did I mention the roofs? Thatched roofs might look cute in paintings, but in freezing weather they become ice traps. Snow piled on top, melted a little in the sun, froze again at night. Eventually ice would drip through and refreeze inside the house. You'd be sitting at your table and hear a soft plink, 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 as icicles formed on your rafters. It was magical. In a sad, frosty way. So what did people do? They adapted. Sort of. They dug trenches in the snow to walk between the house and barn. They kept animals indoors, even when it got crowded, and let's be honest, a little smelly. They layered straw against the walls. They slept in one room, all together, like a pile of half-frozen laundry. Sometimes they burned furniture, chairs, fence posts, whatever would fit in the fire, because staying warm mattered more than sitting comfortably. The farm wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a battlefield. One fought in silence with numb hands against a winter that didn't care who won. And no matter how well you prepared, no matter how neatly you stacked your hay, or how early you brought in your crops, nothing really worked when the whole world turned to ice. Still, they didn't give up, because peasants never did. They kept feeding the animals. They kept the fire alive. They kept trudging out each morning with frozen boots and foggy breath, trying to do the impossible in a winter that wouldn't end. And somehow, unbelievably, some of them made it through. Cold hands, colder roads, so you've got your fire burning. Your stew is mostly warm water. Your cow is mad at you. And the chickens have unionized. But now you need to leave the house. Why? Well, maybe your cousin in the next village has spare grain. Or you heard a monastery is giving out stale bread. Or if you're lucky, you've got something to sell in the market. A worn-out tool, a bundle of wool, or a really persuasive sack of frozen turnips. Either way, You're heading out into the medieval road system in the worst winter anyone's seen in living memory. Hold on to your socks. Assuming you have socks, let's start with the roads themselves. Calling them roads is generous. Really, they're just dirt paths, or mud paths, or snow paths, depending on the season and your personal optimism. In winter 1431 to 32, they were ice rinks, long, bumpy, freezing cold ice rinks with patches of slush, potholes full of frozen water, and wheel ruts deep enough to lose a boot in. And because snow kept falling, everything kept disappearing. Paths blurred. Markers vanished. You might be halfway to the next village and suddenly realize, wait, this isn't the road. This is a field or a frozen pond, possibly both. Oops, traveling in that kind of cold wasn't just difficult. It was dangerous. There were no snowplows, no salted roads, no GPS saying, in 2 miles freeze to death by a large tree. It was just you, your feet if you were lucky, and maybe a donkey that regretted everything. Let's say you had a cart. Well, wheels didn't roll well in frozen slush. Axles cracked. Hooves slipped. The cart might get stuck halfway up a hill, and good luck pushing a full wooden cart when your hands feel like stiff bread loaves. Even sleds, which usually worked well in snow, had issues. The roads were too rough. You couldn't glide. You just bumped your way forward while your teeth chattered out Morse code. And then there was the cold, the kind that crept under your cloak, past your tunic, through your shirt, and made a permanent home somewhere near your spine. Gloves? If you had them, they were wool, maybe lined with rabbit fur if you were fancy, but wool still got wet. And when it froze solid. You'd pull your gloves off and find your fingers had turned into tiny, angry icicles. People tried everything, stuffing straw in their boots, wrapping feet in cloth, even wearing multiple hoods at once. Some wore entire blankets tied around their waists. It wasn't about fashion. It was about not turning into a medieval popsicle. Let's say you made it to town. Congratulations. Now you have to stand still in the cold for hours trying to sell or trade. No warming stations. No mulled wine. Just wind. Merchants huddled by braziers small. Charcoal heaters, but even those couldn't chase off the chill completely. Your breath puffed like smoke. Your nose ran a marathon. Your toes staged a protest. People bartered quickly. No one wanted to haggle while freezing. It was, here, take the wool. I need onions. I'll settle for warm turnips, please. Sometimes villagers just left food outside unattended. If it was cold enough, and it was, nothing would rot. That was kind of helpful and kind of depressing. And yet, travel didn't stop because it couldn't. Monks still walked between abbeys. Messengers still carried news. Farmers still trudged to market towns, and bakers still begged for flour. There were no snow days in medieval Europe. No work-from-home options. Just hard paths, colder winds, and the hope your boots would hold out for 1 more mile. Now, let's say you didn't make it. Maybe the cold got too sharp, or you twisted an ankle, or the snow was too deep, and you just couldn't keep going. There were only a few options. If you were lucky, someone let you into their barn, or gave you shelter, and their house peasants didn't have guest rooms, but they'd make space near the hearth. If you weren't lucky, you'd dig into a snowbank and try to wait it out. Some folks carried wool blankets. Others huddled in cloaks, pressing against trees or rocks for wind cover. Frostbite was common, especially fingers, toes, ears, and noses. Not a great time to be a statue impersonator. Back at home, people worried Dot if your father or brother or daughter went to town and didn't come back by nightfall. You didn't sleep. You sat by the fire. You prayed. Maybe you bundled up and went out looking with a torch, squinting through falling snow and calling their name into the dark. Sometimes they came home. Sometimes you found them the next day, curled in a ditch, alive but frozen stiff. Sometimes you didn't find them at all. The church bells kept ringing during that winter. Not for travel advisories. For funerals, priests gave blessings for those who died in fields. Families wept for loved ones who went out for bread and never returned. Entire stories ended halfway through a journey lost somewhere between frost and fog, but still, some people did make it. Some walked for miles, traded beans for barley, and came back with food for the whole family. Some dragged carts through snowdrifts, shouting at the sky, stubborn as anything. Some got lost, then found their way back by following frozen fence posts or familiar hills, because medieval people weren't quitters. They were survivors. Even with cold in their bones and wind in their teeth, they kept going. They didn't have down coats. They didn't have thermoses. They didn't have roads, really, but they had something else, that quiet, gritty kind of determination that doesn't show up in epic poems, but keeps people alive one footstep at a time. And when the frost finally started to melt and the paths turned from ice back into mud and birds sang again, they were still there, sore, tired, hungry, but still walking. When the rivers froze, so let's talk about the rivers, because when winter really means business, and in 1431 to 1432, it absolutely did the rivers freeze, and not just a little bit. We're not talking about a scenic dusting of frost along the banks. We're talking thick, cracking, booming sheets of ice. Entire waterways turned to frozen highways. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was unexpectedly useful. Let's slide into it. First, let's appreciate what a river meant. In the Middle Ages, rivers were the medieval version of an all-purpose app. They watered your crops. They powered your mills. They carried your boats. They took your waste downstream. They were trade routes, food sources, and yes, sometimes laundry facilities. So when the rivers froze, it wasn't just inconvenient. It was like your entire medieval Google Maps, plumbing system, and Grubhub just stopped. Take the Rhine, or the Seine, or the Thames. Up in England, during that bitter winter, these rivers didn't just get a little icy. They froze solid. There are records of people walking across them, carts crossing with barrels and sacks. Even in some towns, setting up temporary markets on the ice. Imagine it. Villagers in wool cloaks, crunching across the frozen river with baskets of root vegetables. A goat slipping around like it's wearing socks. Children trying to ice skate using 2 planks of wood. And a bad idea. It wasn't exactly the Winter Olympics. But it worked. But here's the thing about frozen rivers. They're a mixed blessing. Yes, you could cross them more easily. Yes, it was fun to poke them with sticks and pretend you knew what you were doing. But the problems came quickly. First, no river flow equals no water wheels. And no water wheels meant no powered mills. And no mills meant no ground grain. And no grain meant, well, porridge is hard to make with whole, unground wheat berries. People had to go back to hand grinding, mortar and pestle, heavy stones, back-breaking work just to get enough flour for a sad little loaf of barley bread. Then there was the fishing problem. Got no river movement. Meant fish either went dormant, disappeared, or got harder to reach. You couldn't just toss a net into flowing water. Now you had to cut a hole in the ice, and then wait sometimes for hours, sometimes all day, in freezing temperatures, wind in your face, wondering why the fish were smarter than you. Spoiler, they were. And if the river was your main source of clean water, well, now it was a block of ice. People had to break it open every morning. Buckets clanged, ice chunks flew. Sometimes the hole froze over again by midday, and you had to start all over. Washing clothes became impossible. Bathing, let's be honest, it was already rare. Now it was just dangerous. The result? A lot of crusty socks and extremely strong body odor. Thankfully, everyone smelled equally terrible. A great medieval equalizer. But perhaps the worst problem of all, flooding. Yeah, weird, right? Because when the snow started to melt, and it always does, everything the frozen rivers were holding back came rushing all at once. Ice dams broke. Riverbanks burst. Villages downstream got soaked, sometimes washed away. It was like the winter saved up all its rage and dumped it out in one giant, soggy tantrum. And yet, people adapted. They carved out ice blocks for storage. They used frozen rivers as makeshift roads. They even set up ice fairs in some places. Think of it as a medieval winter market. But everyone's wearing 4 cloaks and trying not to fall over. Some enterprising folks saw an opportunity. Why walk all the way to the next town when the river's frozen straight there? Suddenly you had a new route, a shortcut. It felt like beating the system, even if you were dragging a sled full of firewood while your donkey gave you judgmental side-eye. The whole way. In towns with bridges, things got weirder. Ice sometimes piled up against the bridge supports. Thick sheets wedged into each other like frozen pancakes. The pressure could get so bad that the bridge cracked or collapsed. So instead of a useful crossing, you now had a scenic disaster with ice chunks and villagers going, well, that's not ideal. Repairing it? Not gonna happen until spring. People just found other ways, fording frozen spots, climbing across logs, or simply giving up and going home. Let's not forget the animals. Horses and oxen hated icy roads. Hooves weren't designed for skating. People tried everything: straw, cloth, even nailing bits of metal into shoes for grip. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. One misstep on a frozen river, and now you're pulling a shivering mule out of a SNOW BANK. Still, even with all this, the cracked bridges, the busted mills, the cold so sharp it made your teeth regret existing, the rivers kept their quiet place in people's lives. Kids played on them. Lovers strolled very, very, very carefully on them. Priests gave sermons about the power of nature and the fragility of man, probably while someone in the back tried to chip a hole for fishing. It was hard. It was inconvenient. It was, at times, absolutely ridiculous. But people got through it, because medieval people were nothing if not stubborn. Give them frozen rivers and they'll still try to sell a cabbage on them. and when the ice finally began to crack, when the surface shimmered and groaned, when the first little trickle of water broke through, people watched with quiet awe. Spring was coming. Not today, not tomorrow, but it was coming, and the river would run again. Frozen forests and firewood fiascos. Let's take a walk well, a slow, freezing stumble into the forest dot, because if you lived through the winter of 1431 to 1432, and you didn't want to freeze into a people-shaped ice sculpture, you needed one thing above all else: firewood dot, and a lot of it dot now. Heating in the late Middle Ages wasn't exactly dot advanced, no radiators, no insulation, no thermostat you could angrily poke at while muttering about frostbite. You had two options: start a fire and keep it going, preferably without burning down your house. But here's the problem: the harsher the winter got, the more firewood. People needed dot, and the less firewood there was, because you weren't the only one trudging out into the woods with frozen nostrils and a rusty axe. Everyone was out there. Your neighbors, their neighbors, their goats, probably. Forests were stripped bare. Dead branches disappeared like bread at a famine feast. Even twigs got hoarded like medieval gold. If you saw someone dragging a wheelbarrow of half-dry sticks, they were basically royalty. Let's pause for a moment and consider the tools. You needed an axe, ideally sharpened. A saw, if you were fancy. Maybe a sled or a cart. And you needed hands that could still move in the cold. Not a guarantee. Swinging an axe in sub-zero temperatures? That's not charming. It's a survival workout. Your fingers go numb. Your breath freezes in your beard. Your boots crunch through icy snow. And every 5 minutes you question your life choices. Especially when the tree you just chopped down turns out to be green wood dot, which, as it turns out, burns about as well as a damp sponge. Dry wood was everything. People hoarded it, traded for it, sometimes even stole it. Yes, firewood theft was a thing. You'd wake up to find your neatly stacked pile suddenly less neat. A couple of logs missing. Maybe a suspicious trail of footprints leading to someone else's suspiciously well-stocked hearth. Of course. If you were lucky, you had access to a forest, but not everyone could just waltz into the woods and take what they pleased. Many forests were owned by lords, by monasteries, or by the crown. Cutting wood there without permission, that was poaching, and you didn't want to get caught. Best case, you got yelled at. Worst case, fined, whipped, or stuck in the stocks while villagers threw turnips at your cold, guilty head. So what did people do? They got creative. Some waited until dark. Some claimed they were just collecting fallen branches. Some bribed guards with ale or shared a log or two under the table, because in the depths of winter, warmth was worth the risk. And then there were the townsfolk. If you lived in a city or a crowded village, you probably didn't have a forest nearby. You bought wood. From a cart, from a vendor, from someone who definitely overcharged you because they knew you were desperate. Prices went up like chimney smoke. Firewood became a luxury. A small pile might cost as much as a week's bread, which meant you had to choose, eat, or stay warm. Pick one. People started burning anything. Old furniture, broken tools, fencing, Even dried up animal dung if they were really out of options. Yes, dung fires. Smelly, smoky, and barely hot. But better than freezing. And no one was judging. Everyone smelled weird anyway. Inside homes, things got smoky. Most fireplaces weren't great at ventilation. Roofs were low. Chimneys were half blocked. Soot blackened the walls. Eyes watered. Coughs echoed. But the fire crackled. And that meant survival. Let's talk fire maintenance. Because once you had a fire going, you didn't let it die. People banked fires at night. That meant piling ashes over the embers to keep them glowing until morning got. Then, in the morning, you poked and blew and coaxed the tiniest spark back into a flame. If it worked, you were a hero. If it didn't, you were the one who had to go outside and get more wood. Everyone hated you. In richer homes, there were multiple hearths. Fancy. You could heat more than one room, but most people huddled in one spot. Everyone, grandparents, kids, dogs, chickens, crowded around the single source of warmth. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't spacious, but it was tolerable, and that's what you aimed for in the harshest winter. Tolerable. Even monasteries weren't spared. Monks with shaved heads and cold toes took shifts chopping firewood in silent groves. Scriptorium scribes worked in mittens, ink freezing in their wells. Some monks even got frostbite while copying texts. That's dedication, or maybe just bad heating policy. Either way, they kept writing, probably by candlelight. Definitely while shivering. So, what did this all mean? It meant that survival wasn't just about braving snowstorms or eating weird root vegetables. It was about keeping the fire going. Literally. The fire was the center of life. Cooked your food, warmed your hands, lit your nights, let you hope for morning. Without it, you were just a very cold person wrapped in a sackcloth blanket, wondering why you didn't move to Sicily when you had the chance. Eventually, the cold began to ease. Logs were burned to stumps. Fires became coals. Ashes were swept, and somewhere, someone stepped into the thawing woods and saw a single green bud, a whisper of spring. The fire had lasted. So had they. What's for dinner? Spoiler. Not much. Let's say you've got your fire going. The wood pile's low, but holding. Now you turn to the next problem, an important one. A deeply medieval one. Food. What do you eat during the harshest winter of the 15th century? Not much, and definitely nothing fancy. You see, by the time winter rolled in, especially a brutal one like 1431 to 1432, most of the harvest was long gone. Grain stores were dwindling, cellars were emptying, and the rats were getting bolder. By the day, your pantry probably held some shriveled onions, a few turnips with attitude, maybe a sack of barley that now had weevils, and dried peas that had the texture of gravel. Delicious. Fresh anything? Forget about it. No tomatoes. No potatoes. No tropical fruit salad. This was pre-Columbian Europe, baby. Your exotic winter treat might be a really nice cabbage. Now, if you were a wealthy noble, you could probably afford preserved meats, imported, spices, and aged cheeses that didn't smell like despair. But if you were anyone else, and let's face it, most people were then, your meals were more experimental. You made stew. You made gruel. You made porridge. And then you tried to pretend it didn't taste like boiled sock water. Here's a typical winter dish. Boil water, add barley or oats, throw in onions if you have them, maybe some. Bits of salted meat. Let it simmer until it resembles sadness voila. Medieval dinner is served. Bon appetite. Don't break your teeth on the bones. But wait, it gets more depressing. If the harvest the year before had been bad, and oh yes, it had, then your grain stores were already low, going into winter dot. And if you were a peasant, you owed a portion of that grain to your lord dot. So even when you were starving, you might be forced to hand over your last sack of rye so someone else could have pie. Not fair. Not new. Very medieval dot. People got desperate. Some turned to foraging. Frozen berries, tree bark, even moss in extreme cases. Others ground up acorns or chestnuts to stretch flour. The result was bread so dense and bitter it doubled as a doorstop. And yet you ate it. Because hunger is persuasive like that. Let's talk meat. It was rare in winter. Even rare during a famine winter. You might have salted pork from a fall. Slaughter, if you were lucky. Or some dried fish, cod, herring, eel hanging from your rafters like medieval air fresheners. But otherwise, no cows, no chickens. You weren't eating your animals. They were too valuable alive. Cows gave milk. Chickens gave eggs. Pigs. Okay, pigs were fair game, but most were long eaten by December dot, so people turned to small game. Rabbits, birds, squirrels, that is, if you had a trap, a bow, or the courage to wrestle a raccoon for your supper. Soup became king. Everyone had a pot on the fire. It simmered all day. You'd toss in whatever you had. Cabbage? Sure. Old bread? And it goes. Bone from last week? Yep. Flavor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hot. And hot meant hope. Now, here's where it gets grim. In some places, there was no food left at all. People boiled shoe leather, made soup from animal hides, chewed on belts. And in a few dark corners of Europe, yes, they may have eaten each other. Famine doesn't ask permission. But let's pull back from the darkness for a second, because despite it all, people shared. Neighbors traded root vegetables. Monks handed out bread. Communities pooled food into common pots. Soup kitchens existed even then, and while they didn't serve much, they did serve something. Also, ale. People still drank. Sometimes it was safer than water. A bit of weak ale could warm you, fill your belly, and dull the edge of hunger. Of course, if you drank too much on an empty stomach, you might pass out and wake up with your eyebrows frozen. Still worth it. What about sweets? Well, no chocolate. No sugar for most people. But maybe you had honey. Maybe some dried apples. Maybe a hard little cake made of flour, lard, and sadness. Or if it was a feast day, a slice of fruit-stuffed pastry, eaten slowly and remembered for weeks. Feast days were actually important. They gave people a reason to eat a little more, drink a little stronger, and tell stories around the fire. It was less about celebration and more about survival. A morale boost. A reason to keep going, even if all you had was a potato, like turnip and a prayer. And yet people survived. Somehow. They figured out how to make that sack of barley stretch one more week. How to turn frozen roots into something like food. How? To make the scraps last. They fed their children first, ate what was left, and when that ran out, they told stories, lit candles, and waited for spring, because food wasn't just fuel. It was community. It was hope. It was a way of saying we're still here, and that counted for something. The church, the cold, and a lot of praying. You've eaten your turnip stew. You've warmed your toes by the fire. The snow is still falling, and your fingers are crossed. The roof holds another day. What now? If you were a medieval person, there was one more thing to do. Pray. Because winter wasn't just cold. It wasn't just hunger and aching joints. It felt like judgment. And for many people in the 1430s, a winter like this one wasn't just a fluke of the weather. It was a sign of what? Well, take your pick. Divine punishment, apocalyptic prophecy, or just God's will in a confusing and slightly chilly form. Either way, people turned to the church. And the church? It was more than a place to hear sermons and admire stained glass. It was the heart of the community. In the village, the church was where you gathered, you heard news, you got help, you got somewhat warmer stone walls, and a roof were better than nothing. And if you were lucky, there was a fire inside, and maybe a monk who didn't mind you hovering near it. But mostly, people went there to beg for mercy. They lit candles, kneeled in the cold, whispered prayers with chapped lips, things like, "Lord, send spring soon. Forgive us for whatever made the sun angry. Let us keep our children another night." Because remember, this was a world before science explained weather patterns. If the crops failed and the snow wouldn't stop, well, maybe someone sinned. Maybe everyone sinned. So what did that mean? Well, for one thing, more church. Longer masses, special processions, public prayers out in the freezing open air. Even children were made to join, wrapped up in rags, carrying little icons, and trying not to slip on icy cobblestones. And if things got really bad, communities would walk barefoot through the snow, singing hymns of repentance. Try that with no socks. And it wasn't just about asking for warmth. People asked for everything: bread, healing, strength, forgiveness, mercy. Because when the world felt out of control, faith was something you could still hold on to, even if your fingers were numb. Monasteries played a big role too. They weren't just places of prayer. They were kind of like medieval relief centers. Monks and nuns helped the poor, handed out bread, offered shelter if they had room, tended to the sick even if they didn't have much to give. And when famine hit, monasteries sometimes opened their granaries, not because they had endless supplies. They didn't. But because they believed it was the right thing to do. So if you were starving in the winter of 1431 to 1432, you might make your way to a nearby abbey and hope. Did it always work? No. Sometimes the monks had nothing left either. Sometimes the church was just as cold and empty as your home, but still people came. Because the church was, if nothing else, a place where your suffering felt seen. And that mattered. Also, you couldn't forget about saints. People prayed to specific ones for help, like St. Nicholas, not just for gifts, but for protecting the poor in winter. St. Apollonia, when your teeth ached from the cold. St. Anthony, for general illness, hunger, and frostbitten toes. They lit candles to them, sighed novenas, carried little relics and tokens, hoping a miracle might arrive, or at least a break in the clouds. There were also superstitions. Plenty of them. Some believed that if you swept your house clockwise before sunrise, it would bring warmth, or that burning certain herbs would drive off evil spirits, and maybe the cold, too. Or that wearing a sprig of holly could protect you from both frost and bad luck. Did it work? Probably not. Did it help people feel less helpless? Yes. And in a winter like this, that counted. And let's not forget about community, faith rituals. Every village had its own thing. Sometimes it was lighting a huge bonfire in the center of town. Sometimes it was ringing the church bells at midnight. Sometimes it was simply everyone gathering in silence, hoping, breathing, enduring together. Because even if nothing changed, it felt like doing something. And that feeling? It was as precious as food. So yes, winter was physical. It was chapped skin and sore limbs, empty bellies and smoky fires. But it was also spiritual. Because when the world froze over, people didn't just bundle up. They looked up. They knelt. They sang. They prayed. They didn't always get answers, but they kept asking anyway. And as strange as it sounds, faith helped people survive, not because it changed the weather, not because it magically filled bowls or stacked firewood, but because it gave people something to hold. Something to believe in, something to whisper to the wind. And sometimes that was the one thing between despair and the next sunrise. Winter clothes, layers, lice, and looking medieval. All right, let's talk fashion. No, not royal robes and sparkly crowns. We're talking real people winter clothes, 1430s style. The kind that didn't sparkle, but might smell faintly of goat. Because surviving the harshest winter of the late Middle Ages, it started with layers. Now, medieval peasants didn't have Patagonia, no down jackets, no waterproof boots, but they knew how to pile it on. Layer 1, a linen shirt, soft if you were lucky, probably itchy. Layer 2, wool, lots of it, a tunic, leggings, maybe a hood. Layer 3, whatever you could find, animal skins, old sacks, your uncle's cloak with the suspicious stain. The rule was simple. More is warmer, even if it didn't match. Even if it smelled like the barn. Wool was the MVP. Why? It was warm, even when wet. It was thick. It was everywhere sheep were practically. Medieval celebrities. And if you had a good wool cloak, you wore that thing until it fell apart. Then you patched it. Then you handed it down. Then you used the scraps to make mittens. Nothing was wasted. Especially not warmth. Let's talk hats, because heat rises. And if your head wasn't covered, your body knew it. Men wore woolen caps, sometimes stuffed with straw. Women wore wimples or coifs tied tightly under the chin. Children wore, well, whatever would stay on their heads. You might even wrap a scarf around your whole face like a medieval ninja. Style points, 0, frostbite prevention, 10. Shoes. Hoo boy, medieval shoes were not great. Thin leather soles, no insulation. Basically just foot-shaped sadness. So what did people do? They stuffed them with hay, wrapped cloth around their ankles, and sometimes just skipped shoes altogether and went full hobbit. Toes were cold, always, but at least you didn't ruin your nice boots, because you didn't have any. Let's address the elephant in the room. Lice. Yeah, lice and fleas. And other tiny freeloaders. You see, if you're wearing 4 layers of wool, and you sleep in those layers and you haven't bathed in a while, let's just say you've got company. People dealt with it. They combed. They picked. They occasionally shaved their heads and wore wigs. and they prayed the lice wouldn't freeze before they did. Medieval survival wasn't glamorous. But hey, at least everyone else was itchy to dot. And what about the rich? Did they just strut around in furs, sipping mead by the fire? Kind of, yeah. Wealthier folks had access to fur-lined cloaks, imported wool, silks, and velvets, though not practical for a snowstorm. They wore squirrel fur, rabbit fur, and if they were really fancy ermine dot, but even the rich weren't immune to the cold. Castles were drafty. Tapestries only did so much. If you had a fire in every room, you were royalty. If you had a fire in one room, you were normal. Children had it rough too. No baby snowsuits. Just small versions of adult clothes. Sometimes they'd be bundled like burritos, layers upon layers, arms barely moving. Other times, they just toughed it out in ragged hand, -me-downs. But if you had a good cloak, you might share it with your sibling. Cuddling, equal survival strategy. And speaking of CLOAKS, let single quotes S give them the love they deserve. The medieval cloak was the Swiss Army knife of garments. Blanket, coat, pillow, windshield, portable privacy curtain. Some even had hoods. You could pull it over your head and pretend the snow didn't exist. Cloaks were heavy, damp, often smelled like sheep, but they were lifesavers. Laundry? Don't make me laugh. In winter, laundry was a rare thing. Why? Water was frozen drying. Took days or weeks. Soap was harsh and expensive, so people didn't wash their clothes much. They beat them, brushed off dirt, hung them near the fire and hoped for the best. If something got really gross, you might bury it in snow to freeze the smell out. Medieval dry cleaning. Folks, let's recap your medieval winter wardrobe. Wool. Tunic, wool over tunic, wool leggings, wool socks, if you had any, wool hood or belt, to hold it all together and carry your knife or pouch. Maybe fur. If you were lucky, lice free of charge. It wasn't cute. It wasn't chic, but it worked. Sort of. And the goal wasn't to be warm. The goal was to be less cold. You didn't dress to stroll through the snow. You dressed to survive the night. To keep your fingers, to protect your ears, to avoid frostbite. On places you really didn't want frostbite, and when everything failed, you huddled next to the fire, next to your family, next to your livestock, wrapped in wool, smelling of smoke, and dreaming of spring. Because medieval fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about making it to the next morning. And that, in the winter of 1431 to 1432, was the best look of all. Home sweet icebox. Keeping warm indoors, all right. You're dressed in layers. You've got your wool socks on. You've survived the snowy walk from the barn to the house. Now what? You go inside. And it's still freezing. Welcome to your medieval. Home. The walls. Wattle and daub if you're a peasant. Stone if you're lucky. The roof. Thatched, maybe leaky. The insulation? Your best bet is the cow standing next to you. Medieval homes weren't designed to keep heat in. They were designed to not collapse. Sometimes that was enough, but staying warm indoors, that took work, and firewood, and some creative problem solving. Let's start with the heart of the home. The hearth. Every medieval house had one. No fancy chimney, just a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. Sort of. If the wind wasn't blowing the wrong way, the fire burned in a central pit or hearthstone. It gave heat. light, and that amazing smoky flavor to everything you owned. Clothes, bread, your eyebrows. Firewood was gold. You needed it every day. To cook, to boil water, to warm the room barely. But it wasn't exactly easy to come by. You couldn't just waltz into the forest and start chopping. In many places, woodland rights were restricted. That forest might belong to the local lord or the church, or some noble who hadn't been seen in 3 years. So peasants got crafty. Collected fallen branches, twigs, and brambles, dried animal dung. Yes, really, hey, if it burned, it was fuel. And yes, the fire usually never went out. Relighting it? Not easy. Matches weren't a thing. Flint and steel were slow. So you banked the coals under ash overnight and hoped they'd still be glowing in the morning. Sometimes they weren't. Then it was time to ask a neighbor for help. Got fire? Was a legitimate question in medieval times, and sharing fire was considered good manners. Warmth, community-style. Now let's talk about the layout. Most homes had just one room. Everything happened there. Sleeping, cooking, eating, maybe making, and yes, livestock keeping. Because your animals gave off heat. Chickens, goats, even cows might sleep indoors in the winter. It was smelly, loud, possibly flea-ridden. But at least it was warm-ish. Sleeping arrangements. Think pile-on, whole families, parents, kids, maybe grandma huddled together on straw mattresses or wooden planks covered with cloth. You slept in your clothes, under cloaks, under furs, with your dog, and maybe a pig. Not ideal. But your body heat was the best heater you had. Privacy, laughs in medieval, and let's not forget the roof. Heat rises, which is unfortunate when your roof leaks. Cold air. Many families hung cloth from the rafters to create a kind of indoor tent or canopy. It helped trap warm air, kept out drafts. It also occasionally caught on fire. But that was just a hazard of the job. As for windows, they were mostly holes. No glass, just wooden shutters. Maybe oiled cloth or horn panels if you were lucky. So in winter you closed them tight. No light, less air, more warmth. Also, more smoke build-up. It was cozy in a we might all pass out from lack of oxygen kind of way. Cooking in winter was a battle. You had to get the fire hot enough without wasting wood. Boiling water could take ages. Bread dough might not rise. Stew was a popular choice because it could sit and simmer for hours while you warmed your hands nearby. Also, one pot equals fewer dishes, equals less water needed, equals happy medieval mom. And then there was boredom. Winters were long, cold, dark. You couldn't farm, you couldn't travel. You couldn't binge watch anything. So people repaired tools, spun wool, told stories, played dice, whittled things, stared at the fire, and sometimes they just slept more. Short days meant short activity windows. So, nap time. Who needs productivity when it's 1432 and your toes are numb? For the rich, life indoors was slightly better. They had stone walls, fireplaces, and tapestries, giant cloth hangings that helped block out the cold. They might have feather beds, fur blankets, and private chambers, but even castles were drafty. Even nobles bundled up. In winter, luxury meant 2 fireplaces and an extra cloak, and maybe someone else to chop your firewood. Let's not forget the Smells. A medieval home in winter was fragrant. Smoke-wet wool, muddy boots. Human bodies that hadn't bathed since Michaelmas damp straw. Turnips, you got used to it. Or your nose gave up. Either way, home was where the hearth was. And the hearth was where survival happened. So, how did people stay warm indoors in the harshest winter of the Middle Ages? They huddled. They burned whatever would burn. They wore all their clothes at once. They invited the goat inside, and they hoped for spring. It wasn't cozy in the modern sense, but it was just enough to make it through the night. And sometimes that was all you needed. Frozen fields and empty pantries. The food crisis. Let's talk about food. Or the lack of it. Because when winter hit hard in 1431, it wasn't just the cold that bit. It was the hunger. Back then, medieval life was a rhythm. Plant in spring. Harvest in autumn. Store it. Stretch it. Survive the winter. But in 1431, things didn't go to plan. The summer before had been soggy, cold. Fields flooded. Crops failed. Grain molded before it ripened. Vegetables rotted underground. And by the time winter came around early and furious, the cupboards were already bare. Medieval folks didn't have supermarkets. They had granaries, root cellars, and hope. Grain was life. Barley, rye, oats, and wheat if you could get it. From it came bread hard, dark, chewy. Porridge thick or thin, depending on how poor you were. Ale, because sometimes drinking. Your calories was easier than chewing, but grain doesn't grow in frozen soil. And once your stores were gone, that was it. No delivery truck coming in the morning. No emergency ration packs. Just you, your family, and an increasingly anxious-looking chicken. So what did people eat during that brutal winter? Everything. Everything they could find. The rules of cuisine out the window. Some common meals included acorn soup, bitter, unless you knew how to leach out the tannins, dried peas or beans, if you'd managed to save some boiled roots, turnips, parsnips, whatever hadn't rotted, hard cheese, if it hadn't gone moldy, flatbread made from bran, bark, or crushed weeds. Yes, bark. People ground it into flour substitutes when grain ran out. Desperate times, desperate recipes. Then there was foraging. Even in snow, some herbs clung to life. Nettles, wild garlic. Sorrel. Families sent out children to look under hedges, behind fences, in the woods. It wasn't much, but a handful of greens could mean the difference between scurvy and survival. And if you were really desperate, you might eat mice, hedgehogs, frogs, tree bark, leather boiled into jelly, or worse, your livestock. Killing the family goat meant one hot stew. And no milk come spring. It was a hard choice, and one a lot of families faced. Now, let's not forget preserved food. If you were lucky and smart, you'd smoked meat in the fall, or salted fish, or dried apples. But by February, most of that was long gone. You'd eaten it at Christmas, or traded it for firewood, or watched it mold in the damp of your cellar. Meanwhile, the wealthy still ate better. They had stores of salted meat, imported spices, full larders, but even nobles started feeling the pinch. When the countryside starves, the price of everything rises. A sack of flour could cost a month's wages. A chicken? Out of reach. Even the rich started watering their stews and eyeing their hunting dogs a little differently. Hunger also made people bold, There were thefts, raids, fights over crusts of bread. Markets got tense. Guards stood watch over grain shipments. Some villages banded together, sharing what little they had. Others turned inward, suspicious and scared. Because when people are cold and hungry, kindness can freeze. Churches tried to help. Monasteries handed out what they could: soup, bread, thin beer, but supplies were limited. And by March, even charity ran dry. One of the few things keeping people going? Tradition. Feast days still happened, even if the feast was symbolic. At Candlemas, folks lit candles and prayed for spring. At Lent, they fasted, easy when there's nothing to eat anyway. And at Easter, they hoped for green shoots in the fields. Ritual gave structure. It gave hope. And when you're eating acorn stew, hope goes a long way. There were also clever tricks. Some folks baked stone bread, made from flour, mixed with ground rock or clay to stretch it further. Not great for your teeth, but it filled the belly. Others brewed weak ale to make up for calories lost in food. Even toddlers drank it, because medieval beer, basically soggy bread with bubbles, and much safer than the water. By the end of winter, people looked different. Sunken cheeks, loose belts, eyes that had seen too many empty pots. But somehow they endured, because they had to. They'd seen bad winters before, and they knew spring would come. Eventually. So the next time you open your fridge and sigh, ooh, nothing to eat but leftovers. Remember 1432, when leftovers were a miracle, when bark was bread, when dinner was a handful of dried beans and a prayer. And somehow, people got through it together. When the body gives up, frostbite, fevers, and other medieval illnesses, you can only fight the cold for so long. Layer up. Huddle close. Burn every stick of firewood you have. But sometimes the cold winds. Medieval bodies were tough. They'd been through war, famine, and really questionable hygiene. But even the hardiest villagers couldn't stand up to months of freezing weather. No food and wet boots. By midwinter, illness was everywhere. And I mean everywhere. Let's start with the cold's favorite trick. Frostbite. It crept in slowly, first your fingers, then your toes. Tingling, then numbness, then blackened skin that peeled or turned to rot. People called it winter rot, or dead fingers. There were no mittens from the market, just wool rags. Maybe fur if you were lucky. Children lost toes. Shepherds lost ears. And sometimes you didn't even notice, until something fell off. Next came fevers. When your body's starving and frozen, it lets its guard down. Colds turned into lung infections. Coughs became wheezing, then silence. And let's not even talk about pneumonia. People wrapped themselves in straw or blankets soaked in vinegar. That was medicine back then, bless them. They boiled herbs like horehound, thyme, or elderflower. They lit candles for Saint Sebastian, or Saint Roch, or anyone who might listen. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it didn't. But you want the real villain of winter? Let me introduce dysentery. Because remember, cold equals frozen rivers. Frozen rivers equals no clean water. No clean water equals, yeah, you get it. People drank melted snow, or water stored in barrels with who knows what at the bottom. They got sick, badly. Cramping, bleeding, dehydration, all while freezing and starving. And there weren't hospitals, just your straw bed, your family, and a prayer. And then there was starvation sickness. That's when your body starts eating itself. Your muscles waste away, your belly bloats, ironically, your hair falls out. You can't think straight. People called it hollow sickness or the wasting. It was everywhere by February. In towns and villages. People weakened by cold and hunger caught whatever else was going around. The flu, childhood illnesses, even the plague, still lurking in some corners of Europe like an unwelcome guest who just won't leave. And when someone got sick in your one-room cottage, well, everyone got sick. There was no quarantine, no antibiotics, no hand sanitizer, just hay-stuffed mattresses and faith. But don't think people just gave up. They had remedies. Oh, did they ever want to treat a fever? Try boiling a black hen and sleeping with it under your bed, drinking hot wine with sage, rubbing your chest with goose, fat, and ash, wearing a dried toad around your neck. Not joking. Some worked a little, some didn't, but trying something, anything, helped folks feel like they were doing something. They also relied on healers. Every village had someone, not a doctor exactly, but someone's granny who knew which roots to chew, which poultice to apply, which charm to whisper at the bedside. There were herb women, midwives, monks with books, and wandering healers with pockets full of dried weeds and bold promises. Sometimes they saved lives. Sometimes they just stayed with the dying. But in a winter like 1431, that mattered. Children and the elderly suffered the most. Kids couldn't handle the cold. Old folks had no reserves left. You'd hear stories. A baby who stopped crying one night. A grandfather who didn't wake up in the morning. And yet, families kept going. They still told stories around the hearth, still sang lullabies to hungry babies, still covered the sick with the last good blanket, because that's what people do. Even when their bodies are failing, and when someone died, they were buried in frozen ground, if it could be dug. Otherwise they waited in barns, wrapped in cloth, until spring softened the earth. It was sad. It was normal. It was winter. But here's the wild part. Some people didn't get sick. Some survived with all their toes. Some kids grew stronger, tougher. They built up resistance. Their bodies adapted. And come spring, they were ready to plant again. Because life doesn't stop. Not in the Middle Ages. Not even in the harshest winter in memory. So if you've got a cold today, a runny nose, a fever, and a cozy blanket, count yourself lucky. No bark soup, no blackened toes, no straw bed beside 6 coughing relatives. Just rest. And maybe some tea. Cabin fever. How people stayed sane, and when they didn't. Okay. So let's say you've made it through the first few months of medieval winter. You've got a roof, a few potatoes, half a candle. Great. Now you just need to stay sane for another 2 to 3 months. Easy, right? Except you're stuck in a one-room cottage with your spouse, 4 children, 2 grandparents, 3 chickens, a goat, a neighbor who won't leave, and a draft that seems to come from everywhere the walls are, made of mud and straw. The air smells like smoke, damp wool, and whatever that goat stepped in. And you haven't seen the sun since Michaelma. Welcome to Cabin Fever, 1432 edition. People in the Middle Ages didn't call it cabin fever, of course, but they definitely felt it. Boredom, restlessness, short tempers, strange dreams. talking to yourself. Or the goat, Dot, it's what happens when you're cooped up too long without fresh air, privacy, or a single quiet moment, Dot. So how did people cope? Let's take a look at medieval mental survival strategies. 1. Work. Even when there's nothing to do, medieval folks didn't believe in free time. Even in deep winter, they kept their hands busy. They mended clothes. They carved wooden spoons. They spun wool, patched shoes, twisted rope, and made baskets. Some even practiced indoor agriculture, like growing herbs on windowsills or sprouting beans in old pots. It wasn't exciting, but it gave the mind something to chew on that wasn't just despair. 2. Storytelling. Oh, yes. This was the golden age of telling the same story 100 times. Folk tales, Bible stories, local ghost legends, and, of course, village gossip retold with increasing drama every time. If Grandma had a good tale from her youth, probably involving wolves, witches, or very angry cows, you'd hear it nightly. It wasn't just for fun. It was a way to pass the hours, teach lessons, and remind each other that things had been bad before, and people still made it through. Point 3. Board games, dice, and songs. Yep, they had games. Simple ones like Nine Men's Morris, which was kind of like a medieval tic-tac-toe on hard mode. And dice games were popular too. So was gambling, technically frowned upon, but, well, it was winter. Singing also helped, even if your voice was awful. There were work songs, drinking songs, lullabies, and little rhyming riddles that kids repeated until everyone begged them to stop. Music helped pass time and keep spirits from sinking into the frozen ground. 4. Religious rituals. When everything outside felt completely out of your control, you turned inward and upward. People lit candles to saints, read prayers from worn manuscripts, if they could read, or just sat quietly and listened to the local priest mutter something comforting. Some even fasted more, trying to purify the body. When food was already scarce, others made little household shrines, said grace before every crumb. Belief wasn't just spiritual. It was psychological survival. 5. Crafting weird things. Yes, people got creative, sometimes. A little too creative. In some records we see doll making from scraps and bones, charms carved from wood or clay to keep winter. Demons away paintings on the walls, not masterpieces, but little symbols or saints. Maybe drawn out of boredom more than devotion. When you've got nothing but soot, twine, and time, you make art. Kind of 6. Arguing a little too much, let's be honest. Trapped indoors for months. Nerves frayed. Fuses shortened. Tempers flared. There are accounts of petty fights between neighbors over firewood, accusations of witchcraft because someone's bread didn't rise. Loud public confessions of sins that probably didn't even happen. One guy throwing a turnip at his cousin and being exiled for it. Yes, really, people cracked. It happened. 7. Talking to animals. This one's funny. Until you're doing it yourself. After weeks of isolation, people started seeing their animals not just as livestock, but as companions. The family dog became a therapist. The chickens got names. The goat became part of the family, whether it wanted to or not. Was it weird? Maybe. Was it helpful? Definitely. Who else was going to listen to you ramble about your dreams and fears while everyone else was snoring? 8. Leaving the house anyway. Some folks just couldn't take it. They went for long, frozen walks through the woods, sat alone by the stream, visited neighbors even if it meant risking frostbite, anything for a change of scenery, even if that scenery was a snow-covered field and some suspicious footprints. But the strangest part? Most people got through it. Yes, the walls were thin, the air was cold, the goat was annoying, but winter had an end. Eventually, the snows melted. The daylight returned. The door creaked open, and the world was still there. And people stepped out, blinking in the pale sunlight, ready to start again. So if you're ever trapped indoors feeling stir-crazy, moody, or bored out of your mind, just remember, you're not alone. Not now. Not in 1432. Not ever. Just sing a song. Talk to your cat. Make a doll out of socks and wheat husks. Spring will come. Melting point, when the ice finally broke, and what came next, after months of darkness, of snow piling higher than the cottage roof, of frozen wells, silent roads, and sleepless nights, the ice finally began to melt. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly. The first sign, a faint drip. It might have been mid-March, or even late April. Medieval winters didn't follow calendars, they just overstayed their welcome. But one day, a little rivulet trickled off the eaves. Then another. People woke up to the sound of water, not wind. Of earth, not ice. And that, dear listener, was the medieval equivalent of fireworks. The snow didn't vanish overnight. It collapsed in slow, wet waves, heavy, slushy, reluctant. To leave. It turned fields into mud baths, made rivers overflow. Potholes the size of cauldrons opened in roads. And yet, no one cared, because that meant the worst was over. One. The thaw begins in towns. People began emerging, blinking in the sunlight like they'd forgotten what color was, squinting at the mud with actual affection. Out came the buckets. Out came the rooms. Out came the half-frozen chickens who looked a little offended by the whole ordeal. Roofs were inspected. Chimneys were cleared. And someone, probably a child, ran barefoot through a puddle just because they could. Two. The first fresh food. That moment when the first green thing pushes through the soil. After months of eating turnips and sadness, that was magic. The snowmelt-watered dormant herbs, onions and leeks reawakened in gardens. Shepherds led their sheep to soggy pastures. People made soup just to smell something different. And if a single egg was found, it was treated like a miracle. It wasn't much, but it was new, and new tasted amazing. 3. The messy aftermath. Yes. Let's talk about the mud. Medieval roads, already questionable, turned into swamps. Cartwheels got stuck. Boots were swallowed whole. And if you fell down, you basically became part of the terrain. Wells, once frozen solid, now overflowed with runoff. Sometimes clean, sometimes not so clean. There was flooding in low-lying areas. Rot in the cellars. Dead livestock discovered. Under SNOWBANKS. It wasn't pretty, but it was progress. 4. Fixing what broke once the thaw began. Reality set in. Fences had collapsed. Roofs had caved. Tools had rusted. Barrels had cracked. Animals had escaped, and people had changed too. Some came out of winter weaker, both in body and spirit, thinner, paler, worn. But the work began again, because it had to. Thatched roofs were patched. Grain stores were inspected. Neighbors helped each other, because that's what got them through the cold, and would get them through the mud. 5. The return of color. This was the quiet miracle of spring. After endless months of gray, white, brown, and black, the world suddenly remembered. Blue. Skies cleared, green buds appeared. Dandelions popped up in places no one planted them. Children started playing outside again. Lambs stumbled around on unsteady legs. Even the goats seemed in better moods, and people began to smile without trying. That was rare and beautiful. 6. Preparing for the next year. Yes, really, the moment the world thawed, people weren't just celebrating, they were planning, because medieval life was a loop, not a line. They asked, did we have enough firewood this year? Did we store too many root vegetables or not enough? Did that neighbor steal our cabbage again? Lessons were learned. Gardens were redug, livestock recounted. And someone probably said, well, next winter won't be that bad. Lies. It usually was. Closing parenthesis 7. The first festival, once the danger passed and the sun came out, communities gathered. Maybe it was a church service, maybe just a communal meal, maybe a half-improvised song and dance in the village square. Whatever it was, it reminded people they'd made it. There might have been fresh bread, a bit of ale, a carved flute, a very bad poem. And for one night at least, people stopped worrying and just existed. That in its own way was survival too. 8. Looking back, some people kept a quiet record of the season, a mark on a wall, a note in a book, a prayer of thanks whispered before sleep. The winter of 143-11432 passed into memory. Harsh, long, cruel, but survivable. And if you're listening to this now, nestled under warm blankets, just know you've outlasted your own winters too. Maybe. Not with mud-walled houses and frost-bitten toes, but with patience, with stubbornness, with whatever you could hold on to. And spring always comes back, eventually. Lessons from the cold. What we still carry from the medieval winter, the winter of 1431 to 1432, is long gone. Its winds have quieted. Its fires have burned out. But the lessons, they're still around, woven into how we prepare, how we wait, how we endure cold, literal or not. Because even if we're not huddled around a smoky hearth with frostbitten toes, the instincts of survival, those don't melt away so easily. 1. Food is everything. Let's not kid ourselves. Most of medieval survival came down to one basic fact. You need to eat. Whether it was grain hidden in a barrel or dried peas that tasted like wood chips, food was. The difference between we made it and we didn't. Even today, we still squirrel things away, just in case. Pantries, emergency kits, cupboards filled with 5 types of pasta. That's not paranoia. That's memory. Memory passed down from people who survived winters with nothing but turnips and stubbornness. 2. Fire is life in a time before thermostats and electric blankets. Fire meant survival. It meant warmth. Yes, but also hot meals, dry clothes, and the ability to see after sundown. If the fire went out in winter, the cold came in. And often so did death. Modern life has changed that. But the pull of a warm hearth, The comfort of a cup of something hot when it's stormy outside, still the same. Still ancient. 3. You don't survive alone. This might be the most medieval lesson of all. No one made it through that winter alone. You needed neighbors to share firewood, someone to trade a hunk of cheese for your extra cloak, someone to knock on your door and ask if you were still alive. Even now, survival is rarely a solo act. Whether it's a friend checking in, a stranger holding the elevator, or just knowing someone is one text away, that's the warmth that matters most. 4. Prepare when the sun is shining. Medieval folks didn't wait until winter to stock up. They dried herbs in summer, pickled vegetables, salted meat, split firewood like their lives depended on it, because they did. They knew the cold was coming. It always was. So they got ready early. These days it might mean saving a little money, or fixing the roof before it leaks, or backing up your files. Finally. It's not glamorous. It's not exciting. But when the metaphorical blizzard hits, you'll be glad you did. 5. Comfort is a strategy sometimes. Surviving winter meant more than just not freezing. It meant singing songs in the dark, telling stories, carving wooden spoons, baking flatbread, not because you were hungry, but because the smell made it feel like home. They knew something we often forget. Comfort is fuel. Even now, the right blanket, the right music, the right moment of quiet, those can be the difference between feeling okay and not. Cozy isn't lazy. Cozy is survival. Medieval people knew that. So should we. 6. Resilience looks small surviving that. Brutal winter didn't look like heroism. It looked like a mother boiling thin soup for the third day in a row. A farmer walking through snow to check on a neighbor's goats. A child scraping frost from a window to watch for the sun. Tiny things, quiet things, repeated things, and yet those were the choices that kept people alive. Today, resilience still looks small. Making the bed, showing up, trying again. Medieval folks would understand. 7. Hard times always end, eventually. When you're stuck in the middle of it, the cold, the dark, the endless sameness, it feels like it'll never end. But it does. It always does. The snow melts. The ice breaks. The world creaks back to life. That's not just a metaphor. That's historical fact. Even the worst winters in history ended. So if you're in a hard season of your own, whether it's weather or something else, just know spring is coming. It always is, even if it takes a while. 8. We still tell their stories. Here we are, nearly 600 years later, talking about a winter no one alive remembers. And yet, we do remember. Because people left traces, in letters, in church records, in bones, and boots and broken roof beams. But more importantly, we remember how they survived. With grit, with cleverness, with each other. Their story became our story. And if you're listening to this right now, curled up in your own quiet winter, maybe you'll pass that story on to. Not with scrolls or chronicles, but maybe just with kindness. One last candle. So the harsh winter of 1431 to 1432, it came, it froze, it starved, it shattered, but people lived. Not everyone, but many. And the ones who did so with all the messages and courage it takes to be human in the cold. They weren't superheroes. They were just tired. Hungry, determined, wiping frost off the window, hoping for a better day. Dot. And when the thaw finally came, they didn't cheer. They just got to work. Dot. We are here because they did. The voice softens one last time. So sleep well tonight. You're warmer than they were, safer, fed, wrapped in layers they couldn't imagine, but some part of you still remembers what it means to get through hard seasons. Dot. And when the next one comes, you'll survive too. Dot. Just like they did.